Can you believe my HOA Karen actually called the cops on my wife over a ridiculous $500 fine? I was absolutely livid, but when that officer saw my wife's face, he went white as a ghost and started backing away. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry. I had no idea." Karen's smug smile instantly turned to pure panic as she realized she'd messed up big time. The neighbor we trusted was hiding something huge. This gets absolutely crazy. Comment where you're watching from. I'm Sean Matthews, 38 years old, and I teach American history at Lincoln High School. If dealing with teenagers all day has taught me anything, it's that the sweetest smiles usually hide the biggest schemes. But honestly, even after 15 years of spotting teenage manipulation tactics, I wasn't prepared for what our neighbor had been cooking up in plain sight. My wife, Jane Stone, is 40, and she works in law enforcement, though she keeps that detail pretty private around our neighborhood. Can't say I blame her. Nobody wants their relaxing evening walks interrupted by neighbors asking about traffic tickets or wanting inside information about local crime stats. We've been married 12 years, lived in Meadowbrook Heights for 8 months, and until this whole mess started, I thought we'd found the perfect suburban paradise. Shows what I know about paradise, right? Meadowbrook Heights is one of those planned communities with exactly 47 families, where everyone knows everyone's business, or at least we thought we did. Tree-lined streets, identical mailboxes, HOA rules that ensure every lawn looks like it belongs in a magazine. The kind of place where neighbors wave from their driveways and kids ride bikes until streetlights come on. Haley Sanders had been our HOA president for exactly 4 years when this story begins, and honestly, she was everyone's guardian angel. Organized charity drives that raised thousands for local food banks, mediated neighbor disputes with the wisdom of a trained therapist, and helped elderly residents with grocery shopping and yard work. If you had a problem, any problem, Haley somehow knew about it before you mentioned it and always had the perfect solution ready. Looking back, that should have been our first red flag. Nobody's that helpful without an agenda. The fine arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, tucked in our mailbox like a perfectly normal piece of mail. Professional letterhead, detailed photographs of our mailbox taken from multiple angles, and legitimate city ordinance citations about residential mailbox height requirements. The whole package looked so official, so thoroughly researched, that my first instinct was to assume we'd actually violated some obscure rule. $500 for having our mailbox 2 inches too tall? It seemed ridiculous, but the documentation was impressive. Jane's initial reaction over breakfast was practical and reasonable. Pick your battles, Sean. $500 isn't worth starting a neighborhood war. But something about the whole situation bugged me in ways I couldn't quite articulate. Maybe it was my teacher instincts kicking in, that feeling you get when a student's excuse is technically correct, but something doesn't add up. I started paying attention to details I'd never noticed before, walking our street with the eye of someone looking for inconsistencies. 12 other mailboxes lined our block, and I measured every single one with a tape measure I borrowed from Marcus, our neighborhood handyman. Guess what? 7 of them were actually taller than ours. 3 were shorter, but only by half an inch. Yet somehow, out of 13 total mailboxes on Maple Street, only ours had received a citation. The selective enforcement was so obvious that it was almost insulting. Either Haley was the most incompetent HOA president in suburban history, or she was targeting us specifically for reasons I couldn't understand. Given her reputation for meticulous attention to detail, incompetence seemed unlikely. That left targeting, which raised an uncomfortable question. What had we done to earn special attention from someone who controlled community enforcement? Marcus stopped by Thursday afternoon to fix our fence gate, and during casual conversation, he mentioned something that made my blood run cold. "Oh, by the way," he said while packing up his tools, "Haley asked me to document any property improvements that might need addressing while I'm doing my rounds. You know, just to help people stay compliant with community standards before they get surprised by fines." He said it so casually, like it was the most natural thing in the world for the HOA president to organize systematic surveillance of residents' properties. But I'd been teaching long enough to recognize coordinated intelligence gathering when I saw it. This wasn't helpful community leadership. This was reconnaissance. Haley had been watching our house, specifically, waiting for something she could use against us. Friday afternoon, I was coming home from another exhausting day of trying to teach teenagers about the Constitutional Convention when I dropped my keys while fumbling with our front door. Simple clumsiness, the kind of everyday accident that happens to everyone. The keys bounced and slid behind Jane's decorative plant arrangement by our front window. One of those elaborate displays she's always rearranging because she says it makes our house look more welcoming. As I reached behind the ceramic pots to retrieve my keys, my hand touched something metallic that definitely didn't belong there. My fingers closed around a small, sophisticated device about the size of a quarter, with a tiny lens in the center and professional-grade mounting hardware attached to the back. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. Someone had been watching us, not just watching our property, or our yard work, or our compliance with HOA regulations. Someone had been watching inside our home, recording our private conversations, our arguments, our intimate moments, everything that made our house a sanctuary from the outside world. I sat down hard on our front steps, holding this camera, feeling like I'd just discovered that my students had been secretly recording my personal life for some twisted research project. The violation was so complete, so invasive, that I actually felt nauseous. How long had it been there? What had they seen? What were they planning to do with footage of our private lives? The device wasn't some amateur spy gadget you'd order online. The serial number led me down an internet research rabbit hole that made my hands shake with growing anger. Model SC4400, manufactured by TechSec Industries, a company that sells exclusively to law enforcement agencies and licensed private investigators. This wasn't civilian electronics. This was professional surveillance equipment that required special permits and credentials to purchase. Whoever planted this camera wasn't just some paranoid neighbor with too much time and too many spy movies. This was someone with connections to law enforcement, someone with professional training in surveillance techniques, someone with resources that went far beyond typical suburban drama. When Jane got home that evening, I was still sitting in our living room, staring at the camera in my palm like it might spontaneously explain itself. "Honey, what's wrong?" she asked, and I could hear her cop voice starting to emerge, that subtle shift in tone she uses when her professional instincts detect something seriously off-kilter. I held up the device without saying a word, watching her face cycle through confusion, recognition, and cold fury as she processed what she was seeing. Jane took the camera, examined the model number with the methodical attention of someone trained in evidence handling, and her expression grew darker with each detail she noticed. "This is law enforcement-grade surveillance equipment," she said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of controlled anger I'd only heard a few times in our marriage. "Whoever did this has professional training and serious resources. This isn't some neighbor with boundary issues, Sean. This is someone who knows exactly what they're doing and why they're doing it." Then she asked the question that changed everything, the question that made me realize our mailbox find had never been about community standards or HOA compliance. The question that opened up possibilities I'd never considered, possibilities that scared me more than anything I'd ever faced as a teacher or a husband. "Sean," she said, looking directly into my eyes with an intensity that made my stomach drop, "who else knows I'm a police commander?" The next morning, Jane left for work with a grim expression I'd only seen a few times in our marriage. She'd spent half the night examining that camera, making notes, asking me questions about when I'd noticed Haley paying unusual attention to our house. But neither of us was prepared for what Haley had planned next. At exactly 9:30 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Emergency HOA meeting tonight, 7 p.m., Community Center. Critical community safety concerns require immediate attention. HS." I stared at that message, knowing in my gut this wasn't going to be any ordinary neighborhood gathering. If teaching teenagers taught me anything, it's that when someone calls an emergency meeting, right after you've discovered their scheme, you're about to walk into an ambush. Jane and I arrived at the community center that evening, expecting maybe a dozen people for a discussion about the surveillance camera. Instead, we found 32 families packed into a room that usually hosted book clubs and yoga classes. The turnout was massive, way more than usual for HOA meetings. People who normally couldn't be bothered to attend were suddenly very interested in community safety. That should have been our first red flag. Haley stood at the front of the room with her usual sweet smile, but there was something different in her eyes, something calculating and cold that I'd never noticed before. She had a clipboard. Of course she had a clipboard, and was checking off names as families arrived. The whole thing felt choreographed, like she'd been planning this performance for weeks. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Haley began, her voice dripping with fake concern. We're here tonight because some very troubling issues have come to my attention regarding community security and compliance with our neighborhood standards. I felt Jane tense beside me. This wasn't going to be a discussion. This was going to be a public execution. Haley continued, I've received reports from multiple neighbors about surveillance equipment being discovered in our peaceful community. Equipment that raises serious questions about privacy and safety. The crowd murmured, heads turning to look around the room. I realized with growing horror that we were the only ones who looked confused. Everyone else seemed to know exactly what this meeting was about, which meant Haley had been preparing them. Linda, who lives 3 houses down from us, stood up first. I'm really worried about having surveillance equipment in our neighborhood, she said, her voice shaking with what seemed like genuine fear. I mean, if someone's watching us, how do we know our families are safe? The crowd nodded in agreement. Then Marcus stood up. The same Marcus who had mentioned documenting property improvements just days earlier. Some residents are refusing to follow community standards, he said, avoiding eye contact with us. When people think they're above the rules, it creates problems for everyone. More nodding, more murmurs of agreement. I watched in fascination and horror as Haley orchestrated this performance. Every person who spoke raised their hand exactly when she nodded in their direction. This wasn't a spontaneous community concern. This was a choreographed attack. That's when my teacher instincts kicked into overdrive. I'd seen this exact scenario play out in my classroom 1,000 times. The coordinated student rebellion where everything seems spontaneous but is actually carefully planned. I stood up and the room went quiet. Since we're discussing community standards, I said, letting my classroom authority voice take over, let's talk about illegal surveillance. I pulled out the camera we'd found, holding it up for everyone to see. This was planted behind our window. Professional-grade equipment, the kind you need special permits to buy. So, while we're talking about privacy and safety, maybe we should ask who's been watching our families without permission. The effect was immediate. Some people looked genuinely shocked. They hadn't known about the camera. Others, the ones Haley had clearly coached, tried to maintain their outraged expressions, but I could see doubt creeping in. Haley's mask slipped for just a moment. I caught a flash of pure fury before her sweet smile returned. I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation, she said, but her voice was tight. Perhaps someone was concerned about break-ins in the neighborhood. But I was on a roll now, using every classroom management technique I'd learned over 15 years of teaching. Reasonable explanation, I repeated, for professional surveillance equipment placed to watch inside our home? Equipment that costs thousands of dollars and requires law enforcement credentials to purchase? I looked around the room, making eye contact with neighbors I'd known for years. How many of you think it's reasonable for someone to secretly record your private conversations with your family? The room started to fracture. Marcus looked confused, whispering to Linda, I never said that stuff about standards. Some of the families began looking uncomfortable, realizing they might have been manipulated into attending this meeting. But Haley wasn't done. She played her victim card perfectly, something I'd also seen countless times from students caught in lies. I'm just trying to protect our community, she said, her voice breaking slightly. Someone is clearly trying to intimidate residents who are just following proper procedures. This camera could have been planted by anyone, maybe even to make me look bad after I issued a legitimate fine. The room buzzed with whispered conversations. I could see the divide happening in real time. Some people buying Haley's performance, others starting to question what they'd really been called here to support. Jane squeezed my hand under the table, a signal that she was proud of how I was handling this. But I could also feel the tension radiating from her. This wasn't just about neighborhood drama anymore. Someone had professional surveillance equipment, and now they were trying to turn our entire community against us. The meeting ended abruptly when Haley claimed she needed to consult with proper authorities about these serious allegations. As people filed out, I noticed the split in reactions. Some neighbors avoided eye contact with us completely, clearly still buying whatever story Haley had sold them. But others lingered, looking troubled, like they were starting to realize they'd been used. Marcus approached us in the parking lot, looking genuinely confused. Sean, I swear I never told Haley I was worried about you guys following rules, he said quietly. She asked me to speak tonight, said the community needed to hear about maintaining standards. I thought she meant general maintenance stuff. That's when we knew for certain. Haley had coached multiple people to say specific things, creating the illusion of community concern where none had existed. As people left, I watched Haley make a phone call in the parking lot. She thought she was being discreet, standing by her car with her back to the building, but my classroom-honed hearing caught fragments of her conversation. "We need to accelerate the timeline," she said, her voice sharp and urgent. "They're becoming a problem." The camera was discovered earlier than expected. There was a pause while she listened to whoever was on the other end. Then the words that made my blood run cold. "How long before she figures out who I really am?" I grabbed Jane's arm, nodding toward Haley. We both strained to hear more, but she'd moved too far away. As we walked to our car, one question burned in both our minds. If Haley wasn't who she claimed to be, then who the hell was living next door to us? 24 hours after that disastrous HOA meeting, Haley showed up at our front door with an urgency I'd never seen from her before. Gone was the sweet, helpful neighbor persona. This was someone on a mission, someone operating under pressure. "The fine must be paid today," she said without her usual pleasantries. "No exceptions, no appeals." Jane, who'd been working in our home office, came to the door when she heard the sharp tone. "I've researched the ordinance thoroughly," Jane replied calmly. "It's selectively enforced, and we're filing an appeal through proper channels." That's when I saw something I'd never seen from Haley before. Her mask slipped completely. For just a split second, cold fury flashed across her face before the fake smile returned. But it was too late. We'd both seen the real person underneath, and she was nothing like the helpful neighbor we thought we knew. Haley kept checking her phone every few seconds, like she was operating under some kind of deadline. The woman who usually had all the time in the world for lengthy conversations about community improvement was suddenly in a desperate hurry. "You people don't understand," she said, and there was something dangerous in her voice now. "There are consequences for not following proper procedures." Jane stepped forward, and I could see her shifting into cop mode, shoulders back, voice calm but authoritative. "Are you threatening us, Haley?" The question hung in the air between them. For a moment, I thought Haley might actually admit what this was really about. Instead, she pulled out her phone and dialed 911 right there on our doorstep. "I need officers immediately," she said into the phone. "I have residents who are becoming aggressive about legitimate community enforcement. I'm concerned for my safety and the safety of our neighborhood." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This woman was calling the police because we refused to pay a bogus fine. But then I realized how brilliantly manipulative it was. She wasn't claiming we'd committed a crime. She was framing this as a safety issue requiring immediate police response. She told the dispatcher we were escalating over legitimate citations, and that she was concerned for neighborhood safety. By the time she hung up, I understood we were dealing with someone who knew exactly how to manipulate emergency services. This wasn't some panicked neighbor. This was someone with professional knowledge of how to trigger a police response. Jane and I exchanged glances. We both knew this was calculated, but neither of us could have predicted what was about to happen next. Officer Miller arrived within 8 minutes. Impressive response time for our suburban neighborhood. He was young, maybe late 20s, with the crisp uniform and serious demeanor of someone who took his job seriously. He approached our front door, expecting what sounded like a domestic disturbance involving community regulations. Haley immediately launched into her victim performance. "Officer, thank you for coming so quickly," she said, her voice trembling with fake emotion. "These residents are refusing to comply with legal HOA requirements, and they've become threatening when I tried to resolve this neighborly." Miller nodded professionally and turned to Jane to get her statement on the disturbance. That's when everything changed. The moment his eyes focused on Jane's face, recognition hit him like lightning. His professional composure cracked, his mouth fell open slightly, and he actually took a step backward. "Commander Stone," he said, his voice jumping an octave, "Ma'am, I didn't expect to see you here." The effect on Haley was instantaneous and devastating. Her confident posture literally collapsed. The clipboard dropped from her hands, her mouth fell open, and she stumbled backward like she'd been physically struck. The power dynamic shifted so completely and so suddenly that I actually felt sorry for her for about half a second. Then I remembered the surveillance camera, and the feeling passed. Miller, meanwhile, was clearly struggling with the awkwardness of the situation. Here he was, responding to a call that involved his direct superior in what appeared to be a civil dispute. Jane was equally surprised, but handled it with her usual professionalism. "Hello, Miller," she said calmly. "What exactly is the complaint here?" I watched this exchange thinking this was like watching a student realize they'd just tried to get the principal in trouble with their own boss. But the drama wasn't over. Within 3 minutes, Officer Johnson arrived as backup, standard procedure for domestic calls. When he got out of his patrol car and saw Jane, the whole scene repeated itself. "Commander Stone," he called out, his voice confused. "Is everything all right here?" The radio chatter had already started. Dispatch could hear Commander Stone over the open channels, and word was spreading through the Metro Police Department's 156 officers like wildfire. I could see the panic building in Haley's eyes as she realized her perfectly calculated plan was falling apart in spectacular fashion. Instead of Jane being intimidated by police authority, she was the police authority. The two officers kept glancing between Haley and their commander, clearly uncomfortable with the entire situation. Haley tried desperately to recover control. "I don't care what her job is," she said, her voice rising to near hysteria. "Community rules apply to everyone. She can't use her position to intimidate residents." But her hands were shaking visibly now, and the sweet neighbor facade was completely gone. Miller and Johnson exchanged uncomfortable glances. They could see this wasn't the threatening situation Haley had described. These were experienced officers, and they knew the difference between actual domestic disturbance and whatever this had turned into. Miller cleared his throat diplomatically. "Ma'am, HOA disputes are typically civil matters," he explained to Haley. "Police don't usually enforce community association fines unless there's criminal activity involved." Johnson nodded in agreement. "If this is about a fine, you'd need to go through proper HOA procedures or civil court." Meanwhile, Jane's phone was ringing constantly. Word had spread through the department about Commander's HOA situation, and concerned colleagues were calling to check on her. I watched Haley's face as she heard fragments of these conversations. Jane talking to other officers, clearly someone with significant authority and respect. The woman who had thought she was manipulating a regular suburban family was realizing she'd picked a fight with someone who had an entire police department backing her up. The tactical error was so complete, so devastating, that I almost admired the scope of Haley's miscalculation. She had exposed Jane's identity to exactly the people she apparently feared most, law enforcement officers who would remember this interaction and talk about it. As Miller and Johnson prepared to leave, Miller mentioned that any formal complaint involving command staff would require supervisor notification. That's when I saw real terror in Haley's eyes. "Actually, maybe we can work this out neighborly," she said quickly, trying to backtrack. But it was too late. The protocols were already in motion. Miller was professional but firm. When civilians call police about command staff, it gets reported up the chain automatically. There was no taking it back. Haley stood in our driveway, watching her perfect plan crumble, as two police officers drove away discussing their commander's HOA drama over the radio. The story would be all over the department by the end of the shift. That evening, Jane received a call from Captain Morrison. "Stone, half the department is talking about your HOA situation. My office, 8 a.m. sharp. We need to discuss department image and community relations." As Jane hung up, she stared at me with a haunting question in her eyes. "What if this was never about the mailbox, she said quietly. "What if someone wanted every cop in the city to know exactly where I live?" Drop a comment if you've ever had that moment, when you realize someone was playing a much bigger game than you thought. I sat there in our living room, looking at my wife's troubled face, and realized we weren't dealing with an HOA power trip, or even professional surveillance. We were dealing with someone who had specifically targeted a police commander, and now that commander's location and personal life were known to hundreds of law enforcement officers. The question that kept me awake that night was simple. Why would someone want that information spread around? Instead of retreating after her spectacular failure with the police, Haley doubled down in a way that honestly impressed me with its calculated evil. She weaponized the very thing that had destroyed her plan. Everyone now knew Jane was a police commander. Over the next 48 hours, I watched her transform this revelation into the foundation of a whisper campaign that would have made McCarthy proud. The woman was diabolical. She didn't attack Jane directly. Oh no, that would have been too obvious. Instead, she planted seeds of doubt through concerned conversations with neighbors. "I just worry about police surveillance in our peaceful community," she'd say with that perfect expression of innocent concern. You know how these things can escalate when authority figures feel challenged. Linda was the first casualty of Haley's psychological warfare. Within a day of the police incident, she was repeating Haley's talking points almost word for word. "Don't you think it's inappropriate for off-duty police to intimidate neighbors over legitimate community issues?" she asked me when I bumped into her at the mailbox. I could hear Haley's phrases in Linda's mouth, like a virus spreading through our neighborhood. The woman had turned our community into a game board, and she was moving pieces with surgical precision. She was leveraging every existing anxiety about police overreach, every suburban fear about privacy and surveillance. In her hands, Jane's integrity became evidence of corruption. Our refusal to pay the fine transformed into abuse of authority. The social isolation hit fast and hard. Neighbors who had waved cheerfully for years suddenly found urgent reasons to go inside when we appeared. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when Jane and I approached groups in the community areas. Our morning jogs became solo affairs as our usual running partners made increasingly creative excuses. The Hendersons, who had invited us to every barbecue for 3 years, somehow forgot to mention their annual summer party. It was like watching a time-lapse video of social death, orchestrated by someone who understood human psychology better than most therapists. Jane tried to hide how much it hurt, but I could see the confusion in her eyes. She'd spent 15 years building a reputation for fairness and integrity, and now our own neighbors were treating her like a corrupt cop from a bad movie. But I wasn't going to let Haley win without a fight. 15 years of teaching teenagers had prepared me for exactly this kind of psychological warfare. I'd seen kids try to turn classrooms against substitute teachers, watched them spread rumors and manipulate social dynamics with devastating efficiency. The difference was, I knew how to fight back. I started my own campaign, going door to door with evidence and timeline documentation. I presented facts the way I'd present a history lesson, methodically, logically, with supporting evidence. Here's what actually happened, I'd tell neighbors, showing them photos of the surveillance camera, copies of the obviously selective fine enforcement, transcripts of Haley's contradictory statements to different people. Some people listened, others had already chosen their side. The professional attack on Jane was more serious than neighborhood gossip. Captain Morrison called her in for what he diplomatically termed a discussion about community relations and department image. Translation: the brass were worried about negative publicity. Someone in the community had filed formal complaints about Jane using her position to intimidate residents. Someone was spreading rumors about corruption and abuse of authority. Jane came home from that meeting looking shaken for the first time since this whole mess started. "They're not suspending me," she said, "but I'm under scrutiny. Any more community complaints, and I'll face an internal affairs review." That's when I realized the true scope of Haley's strategy. She wasn't just trying to make us miserable, she was systematically destroying Jane's career. Marcus became my first real ally in this war. He approached me 3 days after the infamous police incident, looking genuinely troubled. "Sean, something's not right," he said quietly. "Haley asked me to report any aggressive behavior from you guys, but I've never seen you be aggressive about anything. She wanted me to document interactions that never happened." He showed me a notebook where he'd written down everything Haley had asked him to observe and report over the past several months. It was extensive, detailed, and completely focused on our family. "She's been asking very specific questions about your wife's work schedule, what time she leaves, what time she comes home, whether she brings work materials home," Marcus said. I thought it was just neighborly concern, but now, this feels wrong. That's when I discovered Detective Walsh had been asking similar questions around the neighborhood. Walsh worked Financial Crimes Division at Metro PD, and he had been making casual inquiries about Jane's attitude toward community policing and her relationship with civilian authority. But here's the thing that made my teacher instincts scream. Walsh had transferred to Financial Crimes exactly 6 months ago. The same week, we'd moved to Meadowbrook Heights. When I mentioned this coincidence to Jane, she went very still. "Sean," she said quietly, "what are the odds of that being a coincidence?" We both knew the answer. In police work, just like in teaching, there are no such things as coincidences this convenient. The battle for our community became my full-time obsession outside of school hours. I used every technique I'd learned from managing classroom dynamics and turned it on our neighborhood. I organized small gatherings with families who seemed open to hearing facts instead of rumors. I presented evidence systematically, never attacking Haley directly, but simply laying out timelines and asking questions. Why would someone plant professional surveillance equipment? Why was only our mailbox cited when 12 others are identical? Why did Haley coach specific people to say specific things at the meeting? Slowly, painfully, I started building a resistance network. The Johnsons, the Morales family, elderly Mrs. Patterson, neighbors who valued evidence over emotion, who remembered that we'd been good neighbors for years before this manufactured crisis began. But Haley wasn't standing still either. She escalated her psychological warfare in ways that honestly impressed me with their sophistication. She started a neighborhood safety patrol, complete with official-looking badges and walkie-talkies. She organized community watch meetings where residents discussed concerning behaviors they'd witnessed. She created an atmosphere where everyone was watching everyone else, where normal interactions became suspicious, where our entire community turned into a police state with her as the benevolent dictator. And through it all, she maintained that sweet, concerned neighbors act. To anyone who didn't know the full story, she looked like a dedicated community leader trying to protect residents from an unstable police officer who was abusing her authority. The financial pressure was mounting too. We'd hired a lawyer to deal with the HOA situation, costing us $2,000 we hadn't budgeted for. Jane was considering transferring to a different district to escape the scrutiny, which would mean a longer commute and lower seniority. Our marriage was under stress in ways we'd never experienced. For the first time in 12 years, we were snapping at each other over minor things. Both of us stretched thin by the constant pressure of being watched, judged, and attacked by people who'd been our friends just weeks earlier. That's what made Haley's campaign so effective. It wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about making our entire life miserable, forcing us to question everything, isolating us from our support network until we had nowhere to turn. The breakthrough came when I realized Walsh's questions weren't random. They were specific, targeted, and showed inside knowledge of department procedures and Jane's actual job responsibilities. Someone had been briefing him extensively about our situation, feeding him information that wasn't in any official reports. When I shared this observation with Jane, she made a decision that changed everything. "I'm going to set a trap," she said. "If Walsh is dirty, I'm going to prove it." And the question that haunted both of us as we planned our next move was simple. How deep did this conspiracy go, and what were they really after? Jane spent her weekend planning what she called Operation Fishing Expedition, a sting operation designed to expose Detective Walsh's connection to our neighborhood nightmare. She borrowed recording equipment from the department's evidence room, legitimate surveillance gear that would hold up in court if needed. "If Walsh is dirty, he'll slip up when he thinks he's safe," she explained, while setting up the wire I'd be wearing. "But, Sean, if this goes wrong, if he realizes what we're doing, this could get dangerous fast." I'd never seen my wife this focused, this coldly professional. It was like watching a surgeon prepare for a complex operation, every movement precise and calculated. The plan was simple. I'd meet Walsh for coffee, play the role of concerned husband seeking advice, and see what information he'd reveal that he shouldn't have. Monday morning, I called Walsh and asked to meet him at Metro Diner, a 24-hour place near the police station where cops often grabbed meals between shifts. "I'm really worried about Jane," I told him over the phone. "This HOA situation is affecting her work, and I don't know what to do." Walsh was immediately sympathetic, maybe too sympathetic. "Absolutely, Sean. Community relations are crucial for officers. Let's talk it through." That eagerness should have been my first warning sign. Detectives don't usually have time for lengthy coffee meetings with spouses of colleagues, especially about civil disputes, but I was committed to the plan, and honestly, part of me wanted to believe Walsh was legitimately trying to help. The meeting started innocently enough. Walsh bought my coffee, asked about Jane's stress levels, and nodded sympathetically as I described our neighborhood troubles. But then he started asking questions that made the hair on my neck stand up. "You mentioned surveillance equipment," he said casually. "What kind of camera was it exactly?" When I described the SICK 4400 model, he nodded knowingly. "Yeah, those are law enforcement grade. Expensive stuff. Has Jane considered that maybe someone in her own department might be involved?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. This was information that hadn't been in any police report. Miller and Johnson had never documented the specific camera model. The only way Walsh could know those details was if someone had briefed him privately about our situation. But Walsh wasn't done revealing things he shouldn't know. "I heard about the HOA meeting incident," he continued. "Sounds like this Haley woman really had it out for you guys. Did Jane ever mention if she'd had any previous encounters with community activists or anti-police groups?" That's when I realized how thoroughly briefed he was. He knew details about the meeting, about Haley's behavior, about conversations that had never been officially reported. He was fishing for information about Jane's cases, her professional relationships, and her attitude towards civilian oversight. "You know," he said, leaning forward conspiratorially. In financial crimes, we see a lot of cases where personal disputes escalate into false accusations. If someone wanted to destroy a cop's career, community complaints are an effective weapon. The recording device taped to my chest felt like it was burning through my shirt as Walsh continued revealing insider knowledge. He mentioned Haley's coordination with concerned residents. How could he know about that coordination unless he'd been talking to her directly? He asked about Jane's attitude toward community policing, using the exact phrase that neighbors had reported him saying. Most damning of all, he seemed to know our daily schedules with suspicious accuracy. "Jane usually works late on Thursdays, right?" he asked. "That must be hard on you, being home alone in a hostile neighborhood." Jane had never mentioned her Thursday schedule to any colleague. The only way Walsh could know that information was through surveillance or neighborhood informants. When I got home, Jane and I listened to the recording together. Her face grew darker with each revelation. "He's not just corrupt," she said quietly. "He's working with someone who has detailed knowledge of our personal lives. Someone who's been watching us for months." That's when Jane made the call that changed everything. She contacted Captain Morrison and requested an immediate meeting to discuss potential corruption in the Financial Crimes Division. Within 2 hours, we were sitting in Morrison's office with the recording, watching her captain's face cycle through disbelief, anger, and grim determination. "This is internal affairs territory now," Morrison said. "And if Walsh is dirty, we're going to find out exactly how dirty." The confrontation happened the next morning. Morrison called Walsh into his office, supposedly for a routine case review. Instead, Walsh walked into a room containing Morrison, an internal affairs investigator, and a recording device playing his own voice, revealing information he shouldn't possess. I wasn't there, but Jane described it to me later. Walsh's breakdown was immediate and complete. He slumped in his chair, put his head in his hands, and started talking. "She said she'd help me with my gambling debts," he admitted. $73,000 to people who don't forgive late payments. Lisa promised to make it all go away if I just provided some information about Stone's cases and schedule. Lisa, not Haley, Lisa. That single name unraveled everything we thought we knew about our neighbor. Morrison ran Haley Sanders through every law enforcement database available, and what he found made everyone in the room go silent. The identity was completely fabricated, created in March 2020 with sophisticated documentation that had fooled credit agencies, utility companies, and background check services. But federal databases told a different story. Haley Sanders was Detective Lisa Cooper, missing from the Chicago PD since February 2020, after $347,000 disappeared from the evidence room during a drug seizure audit. She had staged a car accident death in Lake Michigan, complete with an abandoned vehicle and a suicide note, and vanished while investigators assumed they were looking for a body. The scope of Lisa's operation became clear as Walsh provided details about their partnership. This wasn't her first suburban hideout. She'd been operating for 4 years across 3 states, perfecting the helpful HOA president scheme. Springfield, Illinois, for 12 months. Cedar Rapids, Iowa, for 14 months. Normal, Illinois, for 16 months. And now, Meadowbrook Heights for 12 months. Each time, she'd build trust, gain authority, and systematically extract money from residents through fraudulent fines and fake community improvement projects. The total theft across all 4 communities exceeded $2.1 million, $347,000 from the original evidence room, plus $1.753 million from community scams. Walsh's romantic involvement with Lisa added another layer of betrayal that made my stomach turn. They'd been planning to escape together to a non-extradition country once she'd laundered enough money through the HOA schemes. His gambling debts were real, but his cooperation went far beyond information trading. He'd helped her research Jane's background, provided insider knowledge about police procedures, even suggested Meadowbrook Heights as a target because it bordered 3 police jurisdictions, perfect for someone wanting to monitor law enforcement activities without triggering suspicion. That evening, Jane and I held an emergency meeting with all 47 Meadowbrook Heights families at the community center. The same room where Lisa had orchestrated her attack on us became the scene of her exposure. I watched our neighbors' faces as Jane explained the truth. 4 years of helpful interventions had been federal fugitive criminal manipulation. Marcus showed his notebook, documenting everything Lisa had asked him to observe, proving the systematic surveillance operation. Linda broke down crying as she realized how completely she'd been psychologically manipulated and used as an unwitting accomplice in destroying an innocent family's reputation. But when we finished explaining everything and looked around for Lisa to confront her with the evidence, we discovered something that chilled everyone to the bone. Her house was empty, completely, professionally empty, like no one had ever lived there. She'd activated her escape plan during our meeting, vanishing while the entire community learned the truth about who she really was. Marcus made the most disturbing discovery in her basement: detailed files on families in 3 other neighborhoods, complete with recent surveillance photos and personal information. The question that sent ice through everyone's veins was simple. How many other communities was she still watching, and how many other federal fugitives were hiding in plain sight as helpful neighbors? FBI agent Torres arrived in Meadowbrook Heights 6 hours after Lisa Cooper's disappearance, bringing with him a federal task force that had been hunting her for over 4 years. The community center that had hosted book clubs and Lisa's manipulative meetings was suddenly transformed into a command center, with agents setting up communications equipment and interview stations. Lisa Cooper is one of the most sophisticated identity thieves and community infiltrators we've ever tracked, Torres explained to our assembled neighborhood. She's operated successfully in 4 different communities over 4 years, and you people are the first ones who've managed to expose her before she completed her exit strategy. The revelation that we'd actually disrupted a federal fugitive's carefully planned operation felt surreal, like discovering you had accidentally caught a master spy. Torres briefed us on the scope of Lisa's criminal enterprise, and the numbers were staggering. Springfield, Illinois, Cedar Rapids, Iowa, Normal, Illinois, and now Meadowbrook Heights. She'd perfected a 12 to 16-month cycle of infiltration, manipulation, and extraction. The pattern was always identical: establish herself as the helpful HOA president, build emotional dependencies through manufactured crises and solutions, then systematically extract money through fraudulent fines and fake community improvement projects. The total victim count across all 4 communities exceeded 340 families, with financial losses reaching $2.1 million when you included her original evidence room theft. She's not just a thief, Torres said grimly. She's a psychological predator who destroys communities for profit. But Lisa wasn't going down without a fight. 3 hours into the FBI operation, she made a move that showed exactly how dangerous she really was when cornered. Linda had gone home to collect documents the agents requested when she discovered Lisa waiting in her living room. "Don't scream," Lisa said calmly, holding a taser she'd apparently been carrying all along. "You're going to help me get out of here, and if you cooperate, nobody gets hurt." She marched Linda at taser point to the abandoned community center building on the edge of our subdivision, the old facility that had been closed for renovations for 6 months. By the time we realized Linda was missing, Lisa had barricaded herself inside with a hostage and was making demands that showed she still believed she could manipulate her way out of this situation. The federal response was swift and professional. Agent Torres coordinated with local SWAT teams while maintaining phone contact with Lisa inside the building. But even as a cornered fugitive holding a hostage, she tried to work her psychological manipulation magic. "You people don't understand what you've done," she told Torres over the phone, her voice carrying that same sweet reasonableness she'd used for 4 years. "I was protecting this community from real corruption. Jane Stone has been under investigation for months for abuse of authority. I was gathering evidence to protect innocent families from a rogue cop. Even facing federal charges and surrounded by law enforcement, she was still trying to turn the narrative, still attempting to make herself the victim and Jane the villain." Linda later told us that being Lisa's hostage was like getting a masterclass in psychological manipulation from someone who'd perfected it over years of practice. "She spent 2 hours trying to convince me that I was the real victim," Linda said. "That Jane had been using police resources to intimidate neighbors. That the surveillance camera was planted by corrupt cops to frame innocent community leaders. She was so convincing, so calm and reasonable, that for a few minutes I actually started doubting what I'd seen with my own eyes." But Linda had witnessed Lisa's mask slip during the community meeting. She'd seen the cold calculation behind the sweet neighbor facade, and she refused to be manipulated again. Marcus provided crucial intelligence that helped end the standoff safely. His maintenance work on the community center meant he knew the building's layout perfectly: emergency exits, utility access points, structural weak spots that SWAT could use for entry. "She's barricaded the main entrance," he told the tactical team, but there's a service corridor that connects to the old kitchen. If you can get someone through the ventilation system, you can come up behind her position. All 46 remaining families gathered in the parking lot, watching federal agents coordinate the capture of the woman who'd manipulated and stolen from them for a year. It felt like the entire community was holding its breath, hoping Linda would survive this final confrontation with our neighborhood predator. Walsh's cooperation became crucial during the standoff. From his holding cell, he provided detailed information about Lisa's escape plans, her hidden assets, and her psychological pressure points. "She's terrified of being poor again," he told Torres over the phone. "That's what drove her to this life in the first place. Growing up in foster care, never having security. If you want to break her, don't threaten her with prison time. Threaten her with asset forfeiture. Tell her she'll die broke." Walsh also revealed that Lisa had $890,000 hidden in offshore accounts and cryptocurrency wallets, money she'd planned to use for their escape to Belize, where they'd established new identities and a beach house under assumed names. The psychological profile Walsh provided proved accurate. When Torres told Lisa that federal asset forfeiture laws would strip her of every penny she'd stolen, leaving her with nothing but prison debts, her carefully maintained composure cracked. "You can't do that," she screamed over the phone. "That money is mine. I earned it. These people were sheep. They deserve to be fleeced." For the first time, her mask slipped completely in front of law enforcement, revealing the contempt and entitlement that had driven her 4-year crime spree. Torres used that emotional crack to negotiate Linda's release. "Let Linda go, and we'll discuss financial arrangements," he lied smoothly. "Keep her, and you lose everything to legal fees and federal forfeitures." Linda's escape happened during one of Lisa's phone rants about the unfairness of federal seizure laws. While Lisa was distracted arguing with Torres about constitutional protections for white-collar criminals, Linda quietly loosened the zip ties Lisa had used to secure her hands. When SWAT agents breached the service entrance Marcus had identified, Linda was ready. She rolled away from Lisa's position and took cover behind an overturned table while federal agents surrounded the woman who'd terrorized our community for 12 months. Lisa's capture was almost anticlimactic. She surrendered immediately when she realized escape was impossible, returning to her sweet, reasonable persona and asking if someone could call her lawyer. But even in federal custody, Lisa tried one last manipulation that revealed the depth of her criminal thinking. During transport to federal holding, she told Agent Torres that he'd made a terrible mistake. "You people have no idea what you've destroyed," she said with calm certainty. "The corruption I was hiding from you will destroy this community. Jane Stone is just the tip of the iceberg. There are others, bigger fish, and now they know their cover is blown." Torres questioned her extensively about these alleged bigger fish, but Lisa refused to elaborate unless she received immunity deals and witness protection. Whether she was telling the truth or playing one final manipulation game, nobody could determine. After Lisa's capture, Agent Torres pulled me aside with a discovery that added one final twist to our nightmare. "We found encrypted files on her computer," he said quietly. "Files about your neighbors that go back years, detailed psychological profiles, and financial information that suggests a much larger operation than we initially understood. The question we're wrestling with is whether Lisa was really the one in charge, or if someone else was pulling her strings. Tell me in the comments, have you ever discovered that the person you thought was the problem was actually just a small piece of something much bigger? That question haunted me as federal agents continued processing evidence from Lisa's house, knowing that somewhere out there might be other communities dealing with their own versions of helpful neighbors who weren't what they seemed. Lisa Cooper's federal trial began 8 months later and became a media sensation that exposed the scope of community manipulation crimes across the country. The courtroom in downtown Chicago was packed with victims from all 4 communities she'd terrorized, families who'd traveled hundreds of miles to see justice served against the woman who'd systematically destroyed their trust and stolen their money. I sat in the gallery with Jane, watching Lisa maintain her sweet, reasonable demeanor, even while facing 22 federal charges, including identity theft, money laundering, fraud, kidnapping, and impersonating a federal officer. She'd hired expensive lawyers with the money she'd stolen, and they tried every strategy imaginable to paint her as a victim of circumstances, rather than a calculating predator. The prosecution methodically dismantled Lisa's defense with evidence that was overwhelming in its scope and detail. Agent Torres presented financial records showing how she'd laundered $2.1 million through fake community improvement projects across 4 states. Former neighbors from Springfield, Cedar Rapids, and Normal testified about her identical manipulation tactics, the same helpful neighbor persona, and the same manufactured crises followed by convenient solutions. Marcus testified about the systematic surveillance operation she'd run in Meadowbrook Heights, showing the detailed notebook where he'd recorded every request for information she'd made over 12 months. The pattern was undeniable. This wasn't a series of misunderstandings or mental health episodes. This was a professional criminal enterprise executed with cold precision. Linda's testimony was particularly powerful because she'd experienced Lisa's manipulation from both sides, as an unwitting accomplice and as a hostage. She made me believe I was helping protect the community, Linda said from the witness stand, her voice steady despite the emotional difficulty of reliving the experience. She knew exactly what to say to make me doubt my own perceptions, to make me trust her version of events over what I could see with my own eyes. When she held me hostage, I finally understood how calculated every kindness had been, how every helpful gesture was designed to build psychological control she could exploit later. The jury listened intently as Linda described the moment she'd realized their beloved HOA president was actually a federal fugitive who'd been studying them like laboratory subjects. Walsh's testimony provided the most damaging evidence against Lisa because it revealed the sophisticated planning behind her operations. From the witness stand, he described how she'd researched Meadowbrook Heights for months before establishing her false identity there, studying property records, police jurisdiction boundaries, and demographic information to ensure it met her operational requirements. She needed a community that bordered multiple police jurisdictions, Walsh explained, because it gave her access to law enforcement information without triggering suspicion in any single department. She specifically targeted neighborhoods with young families and stable incomes because they were most likely to trust authority figures and pay fraudulent fines without extensive legal challenges. But Lisa's lawyers made one crucial mistake in their defense strategy. They decided to put her on the witness stand, believing her manipulative charm could sway the jury the way it had swayed neighbors for 4 years. Instead, her testimony revealed the depth of her narcissistic entitlement and contempt for her victims. "These people lived boring, predictable lives," she said with calm certainty. "They wanted drama. They wanted someone to solve their problems. They wanted to feel important. I gave them exactly what they craved. If they were too naive to recognize fair exchange of services, that's not criminal. That's natural selection." The jury's faces showed shock and disgust as Lisa described her systematic psychological abuse as if she'd been providing community therapy services. The judge, Federal Judge Harrison, had seen thousands of criminals over 30 years on the bench, but he'd rarely encountered someone who showed such a complete lack of remorse. During sentencing, he addressed Lisa directly. "You have demonstrated a level of psychological manipulation and exploitation that represents a clear and present danger to any community where you might operate. Your victims weren't just robbed of money, they were robbed of their ability to trust their neighbors, their community leaders, their own judgment about human nature." Lisa's sentence reflected the severity of her crimes. 22 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole, full restitution of $2.1 million to all 340 victims, and lifetime prohibitions from holding any community leadership positions. Walsh received a lighter sentence of 3 years of federal prison plus 5 years of supervised probation, but his cooperation came at enormous personal cost. He lost his police pension, his law enforcement career, and his reputation in a profession where integrity means everything. During his sentencing, he broke down completely on the witness stand. "I betrayed everything I swore to protect," he said through tears. "I put innocent families at risk because I was too proud to ask for help with my gambling addiction. Lisa exploited my weakness, but I made the choice to betray my badge and my colleague. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make amends for what I've done." His mandatory gambling addiction treatment and $73,000 in debt restitution seemed almost insignificant compared to the shame of being expelled from law enforcement. The long-term impact of Lisa's case extended far beyond individual punishment. Federal legislation requiring background checks for community association leadership positions was signed into law 9 months after her conviction, with the bill nicknamed the Community Protection Act by media outlets that had covered her trial. Police academies across the country, now include her case in their curriculum about recognizing sophisticated fraud operations and protecting community-police relationships. Universities teaching criminal psychology and sociology use Meadowbrook Heights as a case study in mass manipulation and community resilience. Our neighborhood's experience became a teaching tool for helping other communities recognize and resist predatory manipulation. But the most satisfying consequence was what happened to Lisa in prison itself. Her reputation preceded her to a federal correctional facility where even hardened criminals have codes about protecting communities and families. Inmates who'd spent years running their own scams recognized her tactics and refused to be manipulated. She sits alone in the cafeteria, works alone in the prison laundry, and spends recreation time isolated because other prisoners actively avoid someone whose crimes targeted families and neighborhoods. Her attempts to establish the same helpful, indispensable persona that had worked in suburbia failed completely in an environment where everyone understood manipulation tactics. The ultimate powerlessness was perfect justice for someone who'd built her entire criminal career on psychological control. Our community healing process took time, but it created bonds stronger than what we'd had before Lisa's manipulation. We elected Linda as our new HOA president on a platform of complete transparency and accountability. Every decision documented, every expenditure approved by community vote, every leadership action subject to recall if residents lose confidence. Marcus organized a legitimate neighborhood watch program focused on mutual aid rather than surveillance, helping elderly neighbors with maintenance and organizing community gardens where families work together on shared projects. Mrs. Patterson started a support group for people who have experienced manipulation by trusted authority figures, which has grown to include members from all 4 communities Lisa victimized. Jane received a commendation from the FBI for her role in exposing a complex federal crime operation, and her experience led to a promotion within Metro PD to head a new community liaison division. Our marriage emerged stronger from the crisis because we'd proven we could face a coordinated attack on our family and fight back effectively together. We kept our original mailbox as a monument to standing up against corruption, adding a small plaque that reads, "In memory of trust restored," to remind us that authentic relationships require constant vigilance against those who would exploit our desire to believe in community. 1 year later, when new families moved to Meadowbrook Heights, Mrs. Patterson tells them the story of our experience with professional manipulation. This is a community that learned the difference between genuine help and calculated exploitation, she explains confidently. You're safer here than anywhere because we truly protect each other now, not because someone's telling us to, but because we choose to, based on honest relationships and shared values. Our story spreads as a cautionary tale about trusting appearances, but more importantly, it's become proof that communities can defeat even the most sophisticated predators when they stand together, demand transparency, and refuse to let fear divide them against their own neighbors. That's the power of truth, and that's what Echo Stories is all about, bringing you real experiences that matter. If this story got your heart racing, hit that like button. Until next time, stay safe out there, and we'll see you in the next video.